Because you know when there is a person who built their life, that person who was there when you needed them most, you probably remember them. Or maybe you don't remember. Because many times, the people who love us most are the ones we see least, the ones who work behind the scenes, the ones who care silently, the ones who sacrifice without asking for anything in return. You can perceive when there is a person who disappears from your life as discreetly as they appeared. This is the story about what happens when someone finally realizes what was invisible. Stephen Curry was in his normal day, a multimillionaire man, basketball player, accomplished success. He was on his cell phone, scrolling, watching news, watching other people's lives, when a photo appeared. Photo of a woman. Woman with 81 years old. Woman bent over, tired, holding a broom. Woman cleaning the bathroom of rich people's houses. You can perceive when there is an image that is devastating. That touches something deep. The photo had a caption, 81-year-old still working as housekeeper to survive. No retirement, no family, no hope. You can perceive when there is a story that is common. But when you see the photo, it becomes real. Steph looked at the photo, and something in her face, in the way she moved, seemed familiar. You can perceive when there is recognition that is instantaneous. But that takes seconds to be processed. He enlarged the photo, looked at her face more carefully, the eyes, the lines on her face, the way she held her body despite the pain. No, it can't be. But he knew that face. He knew those hands. He had these eyes taking care of him for decades. You can perceive when there is a moment that changes everything. That paralyzes. The name in the photo was Dorothy Henderson, 81. You can perceive when there is a name that triggers everything. Mrs. Dorothy, his nanny, the woman who raised him. Steph couldn't breathe. Mrs. Dorothy? His Mrs. Dorothy? That woman who was with him when he was a baby? Who held him when he cried? Who fed him when he was hungry? Who taught him his first words? Who taught him how to love? That Mrs. Dorothy? She was, at 81 years old, still working? You can perceive when there is a shock that is absolute. Because in Steph's mind, Mrs. Dorothy had disappeared. He grew up, entered university, started his basketball career, became famous, became rich. And at some point, Mrs. Dorothy disappeared. Not because she did anything wrong, but because she was invisible. You can perceive when there is a person who is so much a part of your life that you don't notice when they leave. Steph looked at the photo again. The woman was cleaning bathroom. She was bent over. She was tired. And no one was helping her. You can perceive when there is a reality that is unbearable. He started asking questions, called his parents. Do you know what happened to Mrs. Dorothy? His parents seemed confused. Mrs. Dorothy? That nanny? Well, she left our employment when you were 12 years old. Do you remember? After that, we don't know. She disappeared. You can perceive when there is a person who was replaced without being formally dismissed. Steph felt guilt, deep guilt, because he, Stephen Curry, the superstar, had not thought about Mrs. Dorothy in decades, had not checked if she was okay, had not offered help, had not remembered. You can perceive when there is guilt that is undeserved, but that is real. Steph began to investigate. He found old contacts, traced people who had worked with his parents, and discovered Mrs. Dorothy was still alive. Mrs. Dorothy was still working. Mrs. Dorothy had retirement? No. Family? No. A house of her own? No. Savings? No. Children to help her? No. Nothing. You can perceive when there is a person who has reached the end of life with nothing, but was still working. Because what else would she do? Die on the street? You can perceive when there is a reality that is brutal. Steph discovered more. Mrs. Dorothy had her name in that photo because she had been featured in a report about elderly people working despite their age. The report had gone viral because it was devastating, because it was common, because there were hundreds of Mrs. Dorothys in this country. Women who raised other people's children. Women who cleaned the houses of the rich. Women who never received formal benefits. Women who work until death. You can perceive when there is injustice that is systematic. And Steph finally sees. Because he was doing exactly what the world was doing. He was passing by. He was ignoring. He was letting Mrs. Dorothy be invisible. You can perceive when there is a person who realizes their own complicity. And in that moment, in that exact moment, Steph Curry made a decision. I will find her. I will know the truth. And I will do something big. He didn't know yet what, but he knew he needed to act. Because Mrs. Dorothy didn't deserve to be invisible. Mrs. Dorothy didn't deserve to be alone. Mrs. Dorothy didn't deserve to be working. Because Mrs. Dorothy had given everything. And it was time to be honored. You can perceive when there is a moment that is decisive. That will change everything. Because you know when there is a moment of reunion that is devastating. When you finally see a person you loved and realize what you lost. This is what happened when Steph finally found her. It took days to trace her exact address, but he had resources, had determination, had guilt, and finally, he arrived at the door of Mrs. Dorothy's house. You can perceive when there is a moment that is a threshold. That will change everything. It was a small apartment, very small, very poor, old building, without paint, with windows that don't close well, a place that seemed to be falling to pieces. You can perceive when there is a living condition that tells a story of neglect. Steph knocked on the door. He waited. And then the door opened. And there she was, Mrs. Dorothy. After decades, you can perceive when there is a person whose face doesn't change, who is still that person despite the time. Steph? Her voice trembled. Oh my God, Steph! You can perceive when there is a person who never expected to see the person they loved. Mrs. Dorothy's eyes became teary, because she had raised this man, and he had disappeared, like most grown-up children disappear from the nannies who raised them. You can perceive when there is a reality that is common, but that is devastating every time. Mrs. Dorothy, can I come in? She let him in. The apartment was even smaller on the inside. Tiny bedroom that was where she slept. A kitchen that fit 2 people standing. A living room that was, at the same time, a living room, dining room, guest bedroom. You can perceive when there is a life that is confined. Mrs. Dorothy offered tea. Tea that she shouldn't be offering, because Steph saw the cabinets were empty. You can perceive when there is a person who shares the last thing they have. They sat down, and Mrs. Dorothy began to speak. When your parents hired me, I was 44 years old, Steph. You were a baby who cried at night. Your parents worked a lot. So I was with you practically 24 hours. You can perceive when there is a person who relives the past. I remember you had a fever one night. You were so scared. Your parents wanted to call the doctor, but I knew what to do. I took care of you, and you got better. And in that moment, I thought, this boy is going to be someone special. You can perceive when there is a person who sees the future. When you grew up, you were so intelligent, Steph, so quick, so determined. And I knew that you were going to do big things. So, when my boyfriend at the time asked me to marry him, she stopped. You said no, said Steph. Yes, said Mrs. Dorothy. I said no. You can perceive when there is a choice that is conscious, because I knew that you needed me, and I chose you. I chose to be with you instead of having my own family. And this was my choice. I made it with open eyes. You can perceive when there is a sacrifice that is deliberate. Steph couldn't speak. Your parents paid me well when you were a child, Steph. Really well. But when you got older, when you were 10, 11, 12 years old, you started to not need a nanny anymore. You went to school, you had friends, you had extracurricular activities. And your parents, they started to call me less. Until one day, your parents called me. And they said, Dorothy, you were wonderful, but I think Steph doesn't need a nanny anymore. You can perceive when there is a moment that is the end. I was 56 years old, Steph. Without formal experience, without education, just experience raising children. What do you do when you are 56 years old and all you know is taking care of children? You can perceive when there is a person who is disposable after usefulness ends. So I started working as a housekeeper, Steph. Cleaning other people's houses. Cleaning the bathrooms of rich people. And I thought, I hoped that when you became famous, when you became rich, maybe you would remember me. She stopped. But you didn't remember. You can perceive when there is a truth that is brutal. Not out of malice, Steph. I know it wasn't malice. It was just life. You grew up. You forgot. It's natural. But I continue cleaning houses. Because at 56 years old, there is no other job for me. Because I was never formally registered. So I don't have insurance. I don't have retirement. Because I chose children and families instead of my own life. You can perceive when there is a consequence that is permanent. Steph was crying now. Mrs. Dorothy, how long have you been cleaning houses? Since you were 12 years old, Steph. That makes 25 years. And before that, for 12 years, I was your nanny. So, in total, I dedicated 37 years to this work. You can perceive when there is a number that is devastating. And now I am 81 years old. My back hurts. My knees don't work well. I can't sleep because I am always worried about money. Because if I stop working, if I can't clean houses anymore, I die, alone on the street. Because I don't have retirement, I don't have family, I don't have anyone. You can perceive when there is vulnerability that is complete. But Mrs. Dorothy, said Steph, you never tried to find me? She smiled with sadness. How? You were a superstar, Steph. You had security. You had assistance. You were busy being successful. And I am an invisible woman who cleans bathrooms. How do you think I would get access to you? You can perceive when there is a system that makes people invisible. Besides, I didn't want to be remembered this way, as a poor person who needs charity. I preferred to stay invisible than have you see me this way. You can perceive when there is dignity that is maintained even at the cost of suffering. Steph took Mrs. Dorothy's hand. Mrs. Dorothy, you raised me. You sacrificed your life for mine. And I didn't even think about you in decades. And you kept working. You kept just to survive. You can perceive when there is guilt that is deserved. This has to end. This ends today. Mrs. Dorothy looked at Steph and began to cry, not because she was happy, but because after 37 years, after decades of invisibility, after sacrificing everything, she, finally, was being seen. You can perceive when there is a moment that is cathartic, that changes everything. Because you know when there is a moment that changes everything? When someone who was invisible, finally, is seen? This was that moment. Steph Curry not only offered money, any rich person can do this. Steph did something different. Steph honored Mrs. Dorothy. First, he offered lifetime retirement, an amount that would be enough for her to never work again, enough to pay bills, enough to live with dignity. You can perceive when there is a person who offers more than money, who offers freedom. But this was not all, because Steph understood something. Mrs. Dorothy didn't just need money. She needed to be honored. She needed the world to know. She needed public recognition. You can perceive when there is a person who understands the power of validation. So Steph did something that few do. He told the story. He published. He went on TV, posted on social media, spoke with journalists, and told everything about Mrs. Dorothy, about how she raised him, about how she sacrificed her life, about how she disappeared into invisibility, about how he found her again, about how she was still working. You can perceive when there is a person who chooses to honor publicly. The story went viral because it was real, because it was true, because it touched something that everyone understands. There is a person in our lives who loved us invisibly. There is a person who sacrificed. There is a person who never received credit. You can perceive when there is a story that is universal. Mrs. Dorothy was not just a nanny, said Steph in an interview. Mrs. Dorothy was a mother when my mother was busy. Mrs. Dorothy was love when I needed it. Mrs. Dorothy was everything. And she deserved to be resting. But she was cleaning bathrooms at 81 years old. This has to change. You can perceive when there are words that are powerful. The community heard, and the community began to move. Honor Dorothy, see the invisible. Hashtags began trending. People began to share their own stories of nannies, of housekeepers, of women who raised them, of women who were invisible. You can perceive when there is a moment that triggers a movement. But Steph didn't stop at public recognition. He went beyond. He bought a house for Mrs. Dorothy. A beautiful house. A house with dignity. A house with a big bedroom for her to sleep well. A house with a kitchen where she can cook. A house with a porch where she can sit and rest. When Mrs. Dorothy saw the house, she fell to her knees. Is this real? Is this mine? You can perceive when there is a person who never imagined having their own place. This is yours, Mrs. Dorothy, said Steph, because you deserved this decades ago. You can perceive when there is an action that is reparative. But Steph still didn't stop, because he understood something even greater. Mrs. Dorothy was just one. There were millions of Mrs. Dorothys. Elderly women who worked without retirement, who were never formally registered, who sacrificed everything, who died in poverty. You can perceive when there is a person who understands the system needs to change. So Steph created a fund in the name of Mrs. Dorothy, the Dorothy Henderson Legacy Fund, a fund to help other women like her, elderly women who worked as domestic workers, who never had benefits, who never had retirement, who worked until death. You can perceive when there is an action that goes beyond one person. Steph put millions into the fund and began to track other nannies, babysitters, housekeepers who had disappeared, and began to honor them, too. The movement grew, because one man's action inspired many. You can perceive when there is a cascading effect that is transformative. But the bigger moment was still to come, because Steph did something that was incredible. He took Mrs. Dorothy to a basketball game, a game at home, in his arena, with a crowd. You can perceive when there is a moment that is public. Before the game started, Steph interrupted everything, microphone in hand, and introduced Mrs. Dorothy to the world. Before this game starts, I want to introduce the person who is more important than any trophy. The person who raised me. The person who loved me when no one else was looking. The person who sacrificed her life. The person who deserved to be resting decades ago. This is Mrs. Dorothy Henderson. You can perceive when there is a moment that is a presentation of honor. And he called Mrs. Dorothy to the court, a woman of 81 years old walking slowly across the court, all eyes on her. You can perceive when there is a person who is seen. And then the entire arena stood up, 20,000 people standing up. Applause. That was thunderous. People shouting, people crying, because they were seeing a moment that was rare, a moment when someone was finally honored, a moment when invisibility turned into visibility. You can perceive when there is applause that is cathartic. Mrs. Dorothy was crying, because for the first time in 37 years of sacrifice, for the first time in 81 years of life, she was seen, honored, celebrated. 20,000 people calling to recognize her sacrifice. You can perceive when there is a moment that is sacred. Steph hugged her, and the world saw, because this was not just a story between two. It was a story that touched every person, that had a person in their life who sacrificed invisibly, who worked without recognition, who deserved honor. You can perceive when there is a moment that redefines what success means, because you know when there is a story that is more than a story. That changes not just one person, but the world. This was that moment. And while Mrs. Dorothy rested in her new house, while Steph saw the impact of his action, there was a lesson that emerged, a deep lesson, a lesson that touched everything. You can perceive when there is a fundamental truth that is revealed. The lesson was about invisibility, because there are millions of Mrs. Dorothys in this world. Women who raised other people's children. Women who cleaned the houses of the rich. Women who cooked meals. Women who took care of children. Women who were everything to a family that was not theirs. You can perceive when there is invisibility that is systematic. These women don't appear in Forbes, don't receive awards, are not remembered. When they die alone, with no one complaining. You can perceive when there is a death that is invisible. But these women, These women are the fabric of our society. Without them, the world would collapse. Because who takes care of the next generation, if not them? Who maintains houses, if not them? Who offers unconditional love, if not them? You can perceive when there is a value that is immeasurable but invisible. And Steph realized an important question. Why did I have to be a millionaire to see the person who loved me? Why did I have to be famous to honor someone who deserved honor? Why did I have to go viral on social media to say thank you? You can perceive when there is a person who questions their own privilege. The answer was uncomfortable. Because the system doesn't honor workers. The system makes caregivers invisible. The system assumes that if they don't make money, they have no value. You can perceive when there is a system that is unjust. And the story of Steph and Mrs. Dorothy revealed this. It revealed that there was a big problem. That affected millions. But that began to be solved when one person said, I will honor. You can perceive when there is an action that is transformative. A movement began to emerge. Other celebrities began to look for their nannies, their housekeepers, their women who raised them, and began to honor them too. Athletes, musicians, actors, business people, all seeking people who were invisible, all honoring sacrifice. You can perceive when there is a movement that is cultural. Governments began to notice, began to consider. Laws began to be proposed to better protect domestic workers, for formal retirement, for benefits, for dignity. You can perceive when there is an action that goes beyond charity. That is justice. But real change began at home. Because when Steph honored Mrs. Dorothy, when Steph said in front of 20,000 people, "This woman is the reason I have everything," he was telling a truth that many ignore. You didn't get where you are alone. You got there because someone took care of you. Someone loved you. Someone sacrificed. You can perceive when there is a truth that is humble. And for an audience of 50-plus years old, this touched deeply, because many 50-plus had a mother who raised them, a nanny who loved them, a housekeeper who helped them, a teacher who believed in them, a grandmother who took care of them. And now they wondered, am I honoring this person? Does she know that she matters? Am I leaving it too late? You can perceive when there is a guilt that is transformative. But Steph also offered hope, because he showed it's never too late. There is always time to say thank you. There is always a way to honor. You can perceive when there is a hope that is real. And the relationship between Steph and Mrs. Dorothy transformed, but not in the way you would expect, because Steph not only paid her, he visited her. She went to dinners with the family. She was part of the family, because she had always been part, just was invisible. You can perceive when there is a relationship that is finally true. And Mrs. Dorothy didn't just rest. She lived. For the first time in 81 years, she lived. Had time to do what she wanted. Had money for small things that bring joy. Had dignity. Had a home. Had family. You can perceive when there is a transformation that is complete. And there was a final lesson that was for generations. The lesson was simple but profound. The people who love us most are many times the ones we see least, the ones who work behind the scenes, the ones who care silently, the ones who sacrifice without asking in return. You can perceive when there is a truth that is universal. Because this lesson was transmitted from generation to generation, children of Steph saw and learned. Father honored the woman who loved him. This is what it means to be great. It is not money. It is not fame. It is not trophies. It is remembering. It is honoring. It is recognizing. You can perceive when there is a lesson that passes through generations, and there was a final message that was for you, for the person who is reading this, for the person who hears this. If you have a mother who sacrificed a nanny, who raised you a teacher, who believed in you a friend, who supported you a grandmother, who took care of you a housekeeper, who helped you, don't wait until you are a millionaire. Don't wait until you are famous. Don't wait until you go viral on social media. Do it now. Say it now. Honor it now. You can perceive when there is an urgency that is true, because the person you love may not be here tomorrow, because gratitude cannot wait, because honor cannot wait, because recognition cannot wait. You can perceive when there is time that is precious. And thus, the story ended. The story of a man who finally saw the woman who loved him invisibly. A story that was simple, but that was profound. But that was universal. But that was transformative. Because what Steph did was not extraordinary. What was extraordinary was what we all can do, if we choose to see, if we choose to honor, if we choose to recognize. You can perceive when there is a power that exists in each one of us. And for Mrs. Dorothy, she rested in her house, rested with dignity, rested honored, rested loved, but not because she was famous, but because she was finally seen. You can perceive when there is a transformation that is complete, and the world learned a lesson, that true wealth is not money. True wealth is remembering, honoring, recognizing. True wealth is loving. True wealth is seeing the people who love you and saying that you see, and showing that you see, and honoring what you see. You can perceive when there is a truth that is final, that is absolute, that is sacred.